I'm Executive Director of the School of International and Public Affairs and Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight. Our event today is part of the Ruth K. and Shepherd Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, SIPA's flagship series, generously supported by the Shepherd Broad Foundation. Our program this evening commemorates the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by exploring how the Hebrew Bible influenced the development of African American cultural and religious expression from the days of slavery to the civil rights movement that Dr. King led so brilliantly. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment, Multicultural Programs and Services, SGA, Student Affairs, the African and African Diaspora Studies Program, the Department of Religious Studies, the FIU Alumni Association, Books and Books, and WPBT. Very special thank you goes to Michael Gillespie and Dr. Kaylee Mathie for conceptualizing the event and doing much of the legwork to make it happen. I'd like Dr. Mathie to say a few words, then I'll introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you. That on behalf of the Multicultural Program and Services Martin Luther King Commemorative Celebration Committee, I'd like to welcome all of you here. I just want to take 2 minutes to bring to you your attention this card that sits outside. It's almost end of the month now, so we have one more activity left. On 31st, we have a MLK Law lecture that titled Membership and Immigration, Today's Civil Rights Agenda by Adalberto Roman, who is a faculty in our College of Law. And that's in the other room, SGC 150. It's at 5 o'clock. I hope you could join us. The exhibit at the museum, MLK at Frost, will continue till February 4th. So we're bringing down all the pieces on February 4th. And there's also an exhibit in the GC Gallery that will come down on this Friday. In addition to that, I also want to bring attention to the program in the study of spirituality. I wear several hats and I do participate actively. There are many events left for the rest of this semester. Please take a look. Some of them are going to be here, some are outside. And at least look at the list of activities, and they all are free except for one. And I hope you will take the opportunity to come and join us in these events. And I thank Dr. Stack for allowing me to say a few words. I thank Dr. Parfait for agreeing to do this, and I thank all of you for being here.
Thank you. Our distinguished speaker is a new member of the FIU family and the faculty of the School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Tuda Parfait is a SIPA research professor and the President Navone Professor of Sephardic and Mizrahi Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at FIU. I am proud to claim that he is also the first research professor to have been appointed at SIPA. Dr. Parfait was the founding director of the Center of Jewish Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where he held the chair in modern Jewish studies. A world expert on the Jews of Asia and Africa, he has presented documentaries for the History Channel, PBS, and the BBC, and has written an impressive 26 books which have been translated into 15 languages. His 2 most recent books are African Zion, Studies in Black Judaism, edited with Edith Bruder and published by Cambridge Scholars Press, and The Development of Black Judaism in Africa and the Americas, just published by Harvard University Press. We are doing a presentation at Books and Books, I think next week. I would invite all of you to come and learn Dr. Parfit's finding. It's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tudor Parfit. Tudor, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Stack, and it's my particular duty to thank Dr. Mathie, whose idea it was that I should give this lecture this evening. And before I do anything else, I'm going to try and put some light on. Okay, I can't do that. Never mind. It's almost 50 years since Martin Luther King's most famous and prophetic speech, "I had a dream." This latter-day Moses, as he's often called, embodies the hopes, fears and aspirations of African Americans like few others. Throughout the USA and the world, as King is commemorated, one senses powerfully that his dream lives on. In this brief talk, I should like to look at some of the biblical roots of the dream of Afro-Americans, many of which are drawn from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, going right back to the early days of African-American experience on this continent. For the most part, African-Americans first encountered the Bible, usually in its English form, in the crushing and disorienting world of slavery. Thanks to the transatlantic slave trade database, edited by David Eltis and David Richardson, we know that about 388,000 Africans were transported directly from Africa to the United States over the course of the slave trade. The importation of new slaves into the United States was banned in 1808. However, between 1525 and 1866, in the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, again, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. Very few black African slaves had any knowledge of the Bible, or indeed of the written word, when they were captured. There are two exceptions to this. Slaves taken in the early years of transatlantic slave trading by the Portuguese from the areas of the Congolese Empire, who may have had some knowledge of Christianity, and Muslim slaves taken throughout the period from Senegambia, the hinterlands of Sierra Leone, and the Gold Coast, who accounted, perhaps, it's not clear, for about 10% of all slaves. The first generation of Muslim slaves was often literate, and in certain cases strove to maintain their religious practices on the plantations, although ultimately their descendants would mostly embrace Christianity. These literate black Muslims probably had considerable influence among other slaves as a result of their literacy, and no doubt passed on something of their knowledge of the world, including stories drawn from the Islamic and Quranic sources. In the middle of the 19th century, we have a rather privileged glimpse at the process by which these Muslim slaves became Christians in a letter which was written, which was discovered by William Brown Hodgson, who was a diplomat, scholar, linguist, and manager of a slave plantation in Savannah. And he came across this note written by one of his slaves. It's a detail which speaks volumes. The note was in fact written in Arabic script and consisted of the phonetically transcribed first verse of the Gospel according to St. John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. This slave had heard the verse somewhere, liked it, remembered it, and written it down in English in the only script he knew. It marks a probable moment in the process of moving from one religion to another. Most slaves, at least initially, only had the option of remembering verses from the Bible, as they could neither read nor write. The institution of remembering is a key feature of the oral traditions which characterize much of African society. The idea of the written word was foreign to the majority of slaves. The spoken word that they heard in the slave farms resonated, but the written word, in the form of the printed Bible, they may have glimpsed in the hands of itinerant preachers or on the polished table of a slave owner's drawing room was silent. Thus emerged what my colleague Henry Louis Gates at Harvard has identified as the trope of the talking book. In the first half of the 18th century, in the memoir of a freed African slave, this victim of Dutch slavers recalls his first encounters with a book. And I quote, "My master used to read prayers in public to the ship's crew every Sabbath day. And when I first saw him read, I was never so surprised in my life as when I saw the book talk to my master. For I thought it did, as I observed him to look upon it and move his lips. I wished it would do the same with me. As soon as my master had done reading, I followed him to the place where he put the book, being mightily delighted with it. And when nobody saw me, I opened it and put my ear down close upon it in great hopes that it would say something to me. But I was very sorry and greatly disappointed when I found that it would not speak. The thought immediately presented itself to me that everybody and everything despised me because I was black." Somewhat later, another slave, John G., who'd just become a Christian, had to be persuaded by the sons of his master that he may well have become a convert, but he was still bound to remain a slave. To this end, they brought proof texts from the Bible, which they brought with them for this very purpose. When they left, the slave subsequently wrote, "I took the book and held it up to my ear to try whether the book would talk to me or not, but it proved to be all in vain, for I could not hear it speak one word." Once African slaves had acquired some knowledge of the Bible, they set about interpreting it. For some, it acted as a palliative. For others, it became a dangerously seditious text, calling them to violent revolt. Viewed from the standpoint of 2013, with all our access to information and opinion, it's easy to forget that for most people in the long centuries of the European slave trade, the Bible alone acted as a guide to life and as the fountain of all knowledge. This was as true of whites as it was of blacks. The Bible was certainly a guidebook to issues of race, which in the post-Enlightenment era became more and more discussed and more central to contemporary debates. The new scientific racialism of the 19th century exploited biblical material in its attempt to explicate the different species of humanity and place them in some kind of order of importance and advancement. The people primarily engaged in this research were Western European, or at least of Western European origin, most of them Anglo-Saxons, as they're referred to here, and curiously enough, in their taxonomies, it was invariably Anglo-Saxons and Western Europeans who came out on top, while sub-Saharan Africans invariably came out on bottom. This fitted with the belief that descendants of Noah's sons, Japhet in Europe, Shem in Asia, and Ham in Africa, populated the three divisions of the world, and Ham's perceived inferiority to Shem and Japhet is based on the account in Genesis in which Noah cursed Ham's son Canaan and his descendants when he discovered that his own son, Ham, had looked at him as he slept, hot, sweaty, naked, and drunk in his tent. The terse passage in question, Genesis 9:20-29, has had such a mighty impact on the world that it's worth reading. And I quote, "And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and was drunken. And he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japhet took a garment, and laid it upon their shoulders, and went backwards, and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his youngest son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. He said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem. And Canaan shall be his servant, and God shall enlarge Japhet, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. It eventually became expedient for the object of Noah's curse to fall squarely on sub-Saharan Africa, identified as the place of the descendants of Ham. The concept of the Negro being the descendant of Ham and carrying in his flesh the stigma of Noah's curse encouraged the enslavement of blacks, following the biblical injunction that a servant of servants shall he be. As this discourse developed, it became axiomatic that the colour black was an outward symbol of worthlessness and degradation. In 1857, James Sloan, an American Presbyterian minister, noted, all Ham's posterity are either black or dark-covered, and thus bear upon their countenances the mark of inferiority which God put upon their progenitor. Black, despised, bowed down are the words used to express the condition and place of Ham's children, bearing the mask of degradation on their skin. The idea that blackness was an immediate consequence of the curse, that all blacks were born into slavery, and that all blacks descended from Ham, was a devastatingly useful pro-slavery argument. Thus, the peak in the international trafficking of slaves was reached at the end of the 18th century, and this coincided, except there was no coincidence, with the most frequent use of the curse of Ham as a biblical justification for the permanent enslavement of black people. One way or another, the pro-slavery interpretation of the Hebrew Bible's curse of Canaan was one that slave owners constantly invoked, and that the slaves in the plantations of the South heard from morning till night. It was the bane of their lives. Another biblical justification for slavery was the idea that Africans in general were the descendants of Cain, and as such, bearers of the curse of Cain. The curse of Cain and the mark of Cain are phrases that originated from Genesis 4, where God declared that Cain, the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, be cursed for murdering his brother. From the early centuries of the Common Era, some Christian and Jewish exegesis had concluded that in fact the mark of Cain was a black skin. In the United States, the Southern Baptist Church used the curse of Cain, as well as the curse of Ham, as potent justification for the institution of the enslavement of black people. Because blacks were a race apart, some Baptist ministers taught that there were two separate heavens, one for blacks and one for whites, and other churches used the curse in support of a ban on ordaining blacks to the ranks of the clergy. In the first quarter of the 19th century, Southern apologists for slavery increasingly grounded their support of slavery in the Bible, and inevitably their arguments invoking the biblical curses impacted upon African Americans. What did they make of it? Many of them had been drawn to the Christian religion and its sacred texts. But what were they buying into? Whose Bible was it after all? Did it belong to the blacks or whites? A sense of this is given in Alice Walker's The Coloured Purple of 1982, where the protagonist, Celie, is talking to her sceptical friend, Shug. Then she, Shug, tell me this, old white man is the same God she used to see when she prayed. If you wait to find God in church, Celie, she says, that's who it's bound to show up, because that's where he lived. How come, I asked? Because that's the one that's in the white folks' white Bible. Shug, I say, God wrote the Bible. White folks have nothing to do with it. How come he looks just like them then? She says, only bigger and a heap more hair. How come the Bible is just like everything else they make? All about them, doing one thing and another. And all the coloured folks doing is getting cursed. The justification of slavery in the Bible was worth its weight in gold to the slave owners, and it could be used to indoctrinate the slaves and to make them submissive and docile. The plantation slave's daily unremitting torment could be perceived as emanating from God, his lot in the world. What effect did this religious knowledge have upon the slaves? Did it make them better slaves? Certainly a slave known to have religion had a higher value than a slave who didn't have religion. We read in the narratives of William Wells Brown, a fugitive slave, published in Boston in 1847, and I quote, "It wasn't uncommon in St. Louis, to pass by an auction stand and behold a woman upon the auction block and hear the seller crying out, 'How much is offered for this woman? She's a good cook, she's a good washer, a good obedient servant, and in addition, she's got religion.' Why should this man tell the purchasers that she's got religion? I answer, and I'm still quoting, because in Missouri, and as far as I have any knowledge of slavery in the other states, the religious teaching consists in teaching the slaves that he must never strike a white man, that God made him for a slave, and that when whipped, he must not find fault. And slave owners find such religion very profitable to them." This being the case, why in God's name did the slave population take to the Bible? Why in God's name is the African American population of this country predominantly Christian? And why, on the other hand, in God's name, did the slave owners do so much to prevent their slaves from acquiring Bibles and learning to read and write? The answer, of course, is that there were things in the Old Testament they wanted slaves to know about, and there were things in the Old Testament that they didn't want slaves to know about. In May 1849 in New York, over a couple of charged, dramatic evenings, there was a famous debate, mainly between two great African Americans, Frederick Douglass, like Martin Luther King, a great orator, who was born a slave, and widely considered to be the most eloquent man in the America of his day, and the black Presbyterian minister Henry Highland Garnet, whose father luckily had escaped a Virginia plantation and made his way to New York with his wife and children. The debate had to do with whether Bibles should be purchased in the North and smuggled into the slave farms of the South. For Garnet, born and brought up in New York, or brought up in New York anyway, it was self-evident that the Bible was a text of liberation, which would enable the slaves to throw off the shackles of oppression. For Douglass, whose Christian white father had raped his black mother and then sold him, his son, to another slaveholder, the question was not so clear. Slave owners so often invoked the Bible as a proof text of the divinely sanctioned and ordained status of the peculiar institution of slavery that he felt that the slave populations of the South should not be contaminated by its message. Frederick Douglass, who won the debate, felt the Bible was the most powerful weapon of the armory of the pro-slavery camp and the stoutest link in the chain of oppression and violence that warranted slavery as the sacred basis for the Christian culture of what would become the Confederacy. He wrote, "I've met many religious coloured people in the South who were under the delusion that God required them to submit to slavery and to wear chains with meekness and humility. Douglass knew full well that the slave owners of the South governed their property with a whip in one hand and a Bible in the other. For Douglass, this was not a time to be shipping Bibles to the South." But where was Henry Highland Garnet, his opponent, coming from? In some ways, as he pointed out, the Bible was a highly potent defense of slavery and racism, but at the same time, it was a text of redemption. Indeed, there were certain verses here and there in the Hebrew Bible which could be exploited by the pro-slavery camp, and we've seen some of them, but the best stories told a completely different story. One of the great foundation myths of the Hebrew Bible, and one which was to have a tremendous appeal for the slaves, was the famous account of the divine deliverance of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, and the divine and utterly unexpected destruction of their masters. The Bible is full of such contradictions, but perhaps the contradictions of the Bible suited the slaves, for in a sense, theirs was the greatest contradiction of all. They were brutalized, tortured, raped, filthy slaves in a beautiful land, which was supposed to be the land of the free. They were on the remotest margins of American society, tucked away out of sight on the plantations and slave farms of the South, for the most part, but at the same time, they were central to the country's most bitter and most divisive debate. As we've seen in the 18th and 19th centuries, very few black Africans in Africa itself were Christian, and the slaves who arrived in the Americas were rarely Christian upon their arrival. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, however, the black population of the United States was exposed to a greater or lesser extent to Christianity, or at the very least to biblical stories. I would ask you here to imagine the grey, dull, repetitive life of the plantation slave. What recreation or entertainment was there? Well, perhaps the only thing that they could look forward to or expect was the odd story. And there's a very good moment in Django Unchained, I don't know whether you've seen it, where the protagonist, Django, is told the story by a German itinerant dentist, the story of Brunhilde, and it's in some ways the most magical moment of a very perplexing film. Among the stories that were told were biblical stories, and the absorption of some of the scripture stories led to a new world being opened up for the slaves. First, a new sacred world, then a metaphorical world against which they could compare themselves, and later an imagined world for some in which they became key players in the sacred drama. Eventually, the Bible stories were to provide a haven for African American slaves from the racial contempt to which they were universally subjected. Black preachers such as J.P. Campbell saw the Bible not as the source of their problems, but as the most powerful defense in every way against those who described black Africans as an inferior, debased race, fit only for eternal servitude. Motifs of hope, bloody revenge, and miraculous deliverance, such as the opening of the Red Sea or the Reed Sea to allow the Israelites to escape and their enemies to drown, the defeat of Goliath by David, the building of Noah's Ark as a means of avoiding destruction, the vengeance wreaked by a blinded Samson upon his sadistic tormentors, all fed into the construction of a new metaphorical identity in which increasingly black slaves imagined themselves as Israelites, toiling in a North American Egypt, brutalized by North American pharaohs, awaiting their Moses who would take them to freedom's land. Despite the lack of literacy among most African slaves, the Old Testament stories, and particularly the narrative of the suffering and subsequent deliverance of the Hebrews in Egypt, oppressed by the crushing might of Pharaoh, spread among the slaves like wildfire. Slaves were able to access the narratives of the Hebrew Bible through a number of means. Some came through spirituals, like when Israel was in Egypt's land, or wade in the water, referring to the crossing of the Red Sea, and famously sung by Harriet Tubman as a warning to runaway slaves to stick to the water, to put pursuing dogs off their scent. See that host all dressed in white? Gods are going to trouble the water. The leader looks like the Israelite. Gods are going to trouble the water. Some biblical stories passed by word of mouth, and occasionally through black preachers such as George Lyle towards the end of the 18th century, and through the work of the early black churches in the South, or through more benign white slave owners, where some domestic slaves were taught some rudiments of reading and writing, and could then read the Bible themselves if they were lucky enough to get their hands on one. Frederick Douglass, I've already mentioned, learned to read from white children in the neighbourhood where he was a slave, and he learned by observing the men with whom he worked as they were reading and writing. As we've seen, some of these stories were transmitted by Muslim slaves who related the Quranic version of the Hebrew narratives. Moses was emphasized as the supreme deliverer in these narratives, and the story of the splitting of the waters of the Red Sea was described in loving detail. Inevitably, it was this story of the Exodus which took the greatest hold on the imagination of the slaves. In the book of Exodus, by the way, the word Exodus comes from the Greek, and it simply means going out, the Lord had ordered the Egyptians to let my people go. This commandment, let my people go, was repeated 7 times in the biblical drama, which climaxes with the crossing of the Red Sea. Let my people go. In this tale of deliverance, African Americans saw their own hopes for freedom from slavery. From them, the story of the Exodus was the biblical narrative that declared loud and clear that God was against American slavery and would sooner or later visit some unimaginably horrible punishment upon the white slave-owning classes. When African Americans first heard the story of the Exodus, they were slaves. What a story. What had God done? He'd organised a mass flight of all of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. That's all. But that's not all. On the shores of the Sea of Reeds, the escaping slaves perceived in the distance dust thrown up by Pharaoh's army, which was in hot pursuit. They could hear the rumble of chariot wheels, the drumming of horses' hooves. They were lost. But no, God commands Moses to wave his rod over the sea, and it opens up to let the children of Israel pass. And deliciously, when the full flower of the Egyptian army followed them, with the intention of dragging them back to build pyramids, the waters closed over them, drowning every last one. The slaves were safe on Freedom's shore, their enemies annihilated. Imagine the exultation of that moment, which in earlier years produced some of the earliest Hebrew poetry, but imagine the impact of that story upon slaves who heard it in the 18th and 19th century in America. The Hebrew poem, one of the earliest, which was created through this exultation and triumph, has Moses declaiming, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously, the horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. And then what happens is that Moses' elderly sister, Miriam, takes the stage. She's got a drum in her hand, an instrument that African American slaves knew all about, and she starts to dance, no doubt triumphantly, and as the woman strutted in front of the emancipated slaves, you can imagine the gestures she made in the direction of Egypt. This sense of triumph is echoed in the spirituals, which are our earliest witnesses to the impact of this account from the Hebrew Bible on the imagination of African Americans. Thus spake the Lord, bold Moses said, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. The book of Exodus provided the slaves with a mytheme which helped them to make sense of the appalling predicament in which they found themselves. Here they see a mirror to their fate. Israelite slaves engaged in back-breaking toil, goaded by sadistic overseers. The Israelites had no recourse. The power which constrained them was overwhelming, all the might of Egypt. Their hope of deliverance was nil, and yet deliverance happened. This became the secret weapon of slave society. A recognition of the impossible circumstances and a hope that the impossible could become possible, hopelessness allied with hope. The message was, of course, highly subversive. the hope that they felt in their hearts and could never openly express for fear of the brutal consequences, was a hope for the destruction of white power. In Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, An Antebellum Sermon, from 1895, the black preacher, speaking in dialect, which I will not attempt to duplicate, says, "They can forge your chains and shackles from the mountain to the sea, but the Lord will send some Moses for to set his children free, and the land shall hear his thunder like a blast from Gabriel's horn, for the Lord of hosts is mighty when he girds his armour on. But for fear someone mistakes me, I will pause right here to say that I'm still a preaching ancient. I ain't talking about today, but I tell you, fellow Christians, things will happen mighty strange. Now the Lord done this for Israel, and his ways don't never change, and the love he showed to Israel wasn't all on Israel spent. Now don't run and tell your masters that I was preaching discontent." Of course, that's exactly what he was doing. He was preaching discontent, and the Hebrew Bible undoubtedly was an inspiration for a number of discontents, slave rebellions and conspiracies. There were plenty of slaves who thought of the destruction of their masters' houses when they sung Joshua for the Battle of Jericho, which describes the success of the Israelite siege of the fortified town of Jericho, when after the simple expedient of walking around the walls and sounding trumpets, the walls disintegrated. And this unimaginable moment is well captured in Django Unchained. As the great W.E.B. Du Bois once noted, the religion of the slaves developed this very dark side. It became, and I quote him, it became darker and more intense, and into his ethics crept a note of revenge, into his songs a day of reckoning close at hand. Some slaves extracted from the Old Testament the notion of out-and-out revolt. The most famous slave revolt was one attached famously to the name of Nat Turner. Nat, who'd learned to read and write as a house slave, studied the Old Testament and committed long passages to memory. Passed from owner to owner, his seething resentment found fertile ground in the history of the Israelites. Particularly drawn to the Hebrew prophets, he began to feel that he too had a prophetic calling. Like the prophets of old, he saw meaning and perceived instructions from natural phenomena such as the colour of the sky or a solar eclipse. He soon came to the belief that he'd been selected by God to carry out a divine mission. Confiding in his fellow slaves, he told them one day soon something great was going to happen. On August the 13th, 1831, the last in a long series of signs was revealed to him in the form of a black spot on the sun, and he allegedly told his acolytes, as the black spot passed over the sun, "So shall the blacks pass over the earth." A week later, near Jerusalem, Virginia, Nat Turner's revolt broke out, in which approximately 60 white men, women and children were killed. His men were eventually killed or captured, and he was hung. In the aftermath of the revolt, much of the blame was pinned on the religious teaching that slaves had been allowed to listen to, and the insidious influence of the Bible, and subsequently the South passed many punitive slave codes, including bans on literacy among slaves. Nonetheless, the Old Testament continued to provide inspiration for insurrection. According to an account published after the Civil War by Moses Dixon, Dixon and 11 other men met in St. Louis in 1846 to form the 12 Knights of Tabor, which was a secret underground body dedicated to the overthrow of slavery in America. The Knights were active in the Underground Railway, and according to this account, there were soon 47,000 members prepared to fight for the cause. The name Tabor invokes the famous battle where the Israelites, under the command of their general Barak, defeated and annihilated a much larger force of Canaanites at Mount Tabor in the land of Israel. By 1857, by one account, there were 150,000 men secretly under arms who were prepared who were preparing a mass uprising in Atlanta, but then the anonymous chief of the organisation called a halt to the revolt on the grounds that a higher power was to take a hand in the struggle between North and South. In the ensuing civil war, black soldiers saw themselves as fighting in the Lord's army just like Moses. Time and time again, the image of Moses, the leader out of slavery, and Moses, the warrior, is invoked in the songs and poetry of African Americans. In this spiritual, the sense of menace is imminent, particularly the refrain. When Moses and his soldiers from Egypt landed to flee, his enemies were in behind him, and in front of him the sea. God raised the water like a wall and opened up the way. And the God that lived in Moses' time is just the same today. It's just the same today, just the same today. And the God that lived in Moses' time is just the same today. The name Moses was regularly appropriated to propel black leaders into this metaphorical space. These include Harriet Tubman, the so-called Moses of the Underground Railway, and Marcus Garvey, black nationalist leader and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, who was known as the Black Moses. A little further afield, Lyndon Pindling, first black Prime Minister of the Bahamas and a great national liberator, was known as the Black Moses. The African-American prophet William S. Crowdy, when he was a little slave boy, got down on his knees and prayed, not to Jesus or to God, but to Moses. Moses became the most important figure in the religion of the slaves. This motif continued in 1966. Rabbi L.A. McKetham, a student of Wentworth Arthur Matthew, the founder of the Black Jewish movement, the Commandment Keepers, noted, "Our leader, our emancipator, proved to be not just a man, but the man. Many have referred to him as being 7 men in one, truly another Moses." In the paradigm of the biblical Exodus, under the inspiring leadership of Moses, African Americans found the essential metaphorical expression of their longing for freedom. Projecting their own lives into Old Testament accounts, African Americans recast their destiny in terms of a consummation of a divine drama, the event of the Exodus. Unlike narratives of recurrence and return, the Exodus story is linear. It moves from oppression and slavery to the land of Egypt, in the land of Egypt, through the wanderings in the Sinai, and finally to the Promised Land. As Edward Said points out in his review of the American political philosopher Michael Waltz's book on Exodus and Revolution, Moses is not an Odysseus who returns home, but a popular leader of a people undergoing both the travails and novel triumphs of national liberation. What we have in Exodus, therefore, is the original form of progressive history, and while other slave revolts in history created no really new or influential type of political activity, it's possible to trace a continuous history from Exodus to the radical politics even of our own time. For the African American population under slavery, sometimes the metaphor that I've referred to was not enough. It's one thing to say American slaves are like Israelites, black leaders are like Israelite leaders. Some decided that they were Israelites in every sense of the word. In this bold enterprise, the Bible narrative of the lost tribes of Israel was used as a means of changing race, of becoming white. This strategy of deracialization was a way of shedding a black skin and the dreadful curses on Ham and Cain, so that black skin, on that black skin, and joining the chosen white peoples of God. Others found a way of escaping blackness by becoming Muslims and creating for themselves an imagined Moorish racial origin. How did this come about? Well, the Israelite trope, in a very specific guise, was active during the 19th century, first in Great Britain and parts of Europe, and then in the United States. in the creation of a new racialised religious identity for white Anglo-Saxons and Celts and other Europeans, and it was called British Israelism. British Israelism and its American counterpart, which became both influential and numerically highly important by the end of the 19th century, and which still have a significant following, perceived the white populations of the British Isles and the United States as being quite literally and biologically descended from the lost tribes of Israel. This freshly minted pedigree, which was underpinned by comprehensive biblical exegesis, as well as by the undeniable success of Anglo-Saxons in recent history, contributed to notions of white supremacy and imperial entitlement, which legitimised the supreme role of Great Britain and later the United States in the domination of the world. Anglo-Israelism redrew some of the central categories of 19th century racial discourse. Some of these lost tribe Anglo-Israelite ideas fed into the emergence of Pentecostalism, which would eventually have a powerful impact upon African Americans, particularly through the teaching of Charles Fox Parham. Parham was an Anglo-Israelite and held deeply racist views. He was particularly opposed to the woeful intermarriage of races begun by Cain, who he thought had bred with some dark pre-Adamic race. In this he was supported by a certain W.F. Carruthers, a lawyer who worked alongside him in the early Pentecostal movement. And Carruthers argued that throughout the history of the world, races had never mixed, and it was the fault of slavery that in the United States, blacks and whites had been forced in recent times into a promiscuous and unfortunate proximity. However, the Holy Spirit had come to the rescue by creating, particularly in whites, a deep sense of racial revulsion, which had the effect of keeping blacks and whites apart. Racial bigotry was not, therefore, according to him, the work of the devil, as some claimed, but the working out of the divine will. Under the influence of this kind of teaching, a black counter-theology came into being, which inserted blacks into sacred history. In 1906, the Pentecostalist movement started to spread through the black churches in Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas, and in this way some of the specific notions of Anglo-Israelism in a black manifestation spread throughout the black communities. The racialized ideas of Anglo-Israelism and some of the early manifestations of the Pentecostal movement which rose from it gave a religious justification, as we've seen, for the widespread notions of white Protestant supremacy. These racial religious ideas were to be endlessly replicated over the next half-century in analogous racialized counter-theologies which sprang up as a kind of mirror image among African Americans and later among Africans. For many blacks, the idea of being able to shed their skin seemed infinitely attractive. Father Divine, the charismatic African American cult leader, famously abolished race for his followers. The concept was not allowed. There was no black or white, and words such as Negro or nigger were banned, even among blacks. Various Muslim groups, such as the Moorish Science movement, which led into the Nation of Islam, similarly maintained that African blacks were Asiatics, and they refused to be categorized as blacks. To distance themselves from the hated appellation of nigger, they awarded each other honorific Muslim titles such as Bey. In the Israelite groups, African Americans viewed themselves as literally the sons of Moses and their leaders as the descendants of the biblical prophets and leaders. Towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King, sometimes, as we've seen, known as America's Moses, invoked the biblical story of the death of Moses. According to the Bible, Moses died and was buried on Mount Nebo, a mountain overlooking the Jordan Valley on the Jordanian side. Here, famously, Moses was permitted a glimpse from the mountaintop, the promised land he was leading the Israelites to, but was not permitted to enter. In his last speech, the day before he was murdered, King said, "And then I got to Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brethren. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't really matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Thank you. Don't know whether questions are a part of the...
Sure.
Sure are. If anybody's got any...
This is microphone.
Anybody's got any questions?
Why not? I just
But
wondered.
here's the microphone. They're taping you.
Hi, I'm Heather Russell. I'm in English. I just had a quick question. I just wondered where you would locate Rastafarianism in your sort of construction of race and Jewish identity and so on.
Yes, Rastafarianism is a very good example of a form of racialized, what I would call racialized religion, and it grows ultimately from the 19th century racist idea, which is known as the Hamitic hypothesis. And the Hamitic hypothesis basically had it that anything of value in Africa came from the northeastern part of the continent, from ancient Egypt, from the Horn of Africa, from Ethiopia and so on. And the impact of Ethiopia, and particularly in the early 20th century of the success of the Ethiopians against, let's say, the Italians. The battle that they won in, I think it was 1896, against Ethiopian forces was the only time that black forces had comprehensively defeated a European invader and would-be colonist. And it had an absolutely stupendous impact upon African Americans and also Africans in other parts of the African diaspora. So ultimately, Rastafarianism owes a great deal to this sense that the liberation of blacks was to be found in Africa, in Ethiopia, but also in people who considered themselves to be Israelites. And just at the moment when these ideas were coming to the fore, it was discovered in America, it had been known elsewhere a little before, that there were indeed Jews in Abyssinia. And some of them visited New York, and again the impact of their visit, the impact of the French Jew Feitlovich, who was, as it were, their great promoter, had an enormous impact, and again fed into early Rastafarianism. Good question, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parfait, for a very fact-filled talk. I have a question that might be too far from your talk, so if it is, just say, that this question belongs in another talk somewhere else. But you talk mostly about, of course, this southern United States, which is mostly Protestant. Can you make any comparisons with Catholic areas, for example, in Louisiana maybe, or certainly Brazil, where many more black slaves were taken back to the United States? The United States only had a small percentage of all of the slaves brought here. Do you have any comments you can make on Catholic areas, maybe Brazil or even Catholic areas of the United States like southern Louisiana, and the treatment of blacks in comparison or contrast to the treatment from white Protestants?
I don't think I can say very much about that. I mean, the only thing I suppose that I could say would be that, you know, we're all familiar with the Middle Passage and the horrors that it brought with it. What is less well known is that there was a second Middle Passage which impacted upon the lives of far more than the 338,000 Africans that came directly to the United States from Africa, and that was the forced migration of slaves in the northern part of the South to the south when cotton became king and when there was an increased need for slaves on the cotton plantations. Now that's brought people from some Catholic areas. I don't think, to be honest, that as far as I know there's much difference in the treatment of slaves depending upon whether people were Catholics or Protestants. It's true that in a different way, I mean, the construction of kind of Jewish identities for some Africans in different parts of the world is much more likely to happen in Protestant areas than Catholic areas, and that's for the very good reason that Catholics don't characteristically read the Bible very much, whereas Baptists and other Protestants spend their time reading the Bible, they know the Bible story, and Catholics have got a different way of going about things, so that would have some kind of impact, I suppose. But I hadn't really thought about that question, but thank you for it, it's a good one.
My impression would be, and I don't really know, maybe you can correct me, is that the Catholics would put more emphasis on the New Testament, whereas Protestants would put more emphasis on the Old Testament, and maybe that would mean that Protestantism is more attractive in some sense because of the stories of slavery in Egypt and Moses and the Old Testament stories. I don't know.
Tutor. I have a comment. I'm John Davidson. I'm in School of Public Health here at FIU. Did you run into any writing about, looks like the first time the Europeans decided to take slaves from Africa, they contact the Pope, because I'm following up and asking about the Catholic religion. It looks like the Pope said, well, according to my research in the Bible, said the blacks don't have a soul. You can go ahead and enslave them. And I was so pleased by one of my friends. And my second question or comment was about the time of colonization was, as we told President Nyerere, who used to be the president of Tanzania, used to say, you can't really trust the Europeans because they came in Africa with a Bible in one hand and a gun on the other hand. So they had to convert to Christianity, otherwise they'd be killed. And I'm wondering that's one of the reasons maybe Africans didn't really embrace religion as they should have.
Well, I don't know, and I think Africans did embrace Christianity fairly enthusiastically and carry on, and they have carried on doing so. Of course, Islam is also very successful in Africa, but Islam has got also Muslim their slavers didn't do very much for the way in which Islam is perceived in some parts of Africa. In the same way that Christianity is also besmirched with the record of slavery and colonialism. But apparently it is the case that more slaves were taken out of Africa to the north and to the northeast than were taken out of Africa towards the west. That may be contested, but I think it's probably true.
are there also liberation narratives in indigenous African religions that were brought to America and that survived?
There are traces of all kinds of African phenomena in the various accounts of slavery by African American slaves. But the very nature of the phenomenon was so utterly destructive, both of language and culture, that not that much survived. The occasional thing is, yes, there are songs and dances, some stories have survived in some form or another, but nothing that really stands up and shouts out, this is a kind of song of liberation, not to my knowledge, but maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you.
Hi, great talk. Quick question, you mentioned how the Bible was used to justify slavery. Are there other religious texts that were used in a similar manner to justify slavery? Slavery is nothing new to this part of the world.
Well, I'm sure that people would use anything to justify anything, and particularly if the premise is shaky. And I think, for an awful lot of people, for hundreds of years anyway, the premise was shaky, and so therefore they needed to beef it up with recourse to a book that had more or less universal approval. What happened in China, for instance, I don't know. So if the question is, are there religious texts throughout the world that support slavery, I couldn't give you an immediate answer to that. The next time we meet for dinner, I will be prepared.
But on that note,
I think there's somebody just coming over here.
Hi, good evening. What can you tell us about the slaves mixing some of their newfound Christian religion with religious practices from Africa?
Well, both in Africa and in the United States and other parts of the African diaspora in the Americas and elsewhere, there were admixtures. And one could talk about this endlessly. It's a massive subject, and a good deal of Christian practice in Africa itself is full of a mixture of what we call syncretism. It's a mixture of religions in a way. The same is true here. But for the people that came directly to the United States from Africa, very often they were split up from their friends and families, people who spoke the same language, and it was very, very difficult for them to preserve much in the way of either their ancestral religious practice or of their cultural practices or linguistic practices. And it's probably more true of Muslims than others, because there were more of them as a particular group, I think. And they also tended to be literate with a very, very good knowledge of a specific source. Some of them even came apparently with a Quran, and there are one or two examples of Qurans that crossed the Atlantic and survived. But thank you for the question.
That was good. Okay, thank you everyone.